Hey everybody, Pastor Tim back with you, along with my friend Charles Newman. He is a Lutheran pastor here in the Valley, and I'm really excited to have a chance to talk with him about his story and about our story together. Before I do that, Charles, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us about your church, tell us about your family.
Sure. Thanks for this opportunity and just time to chat with you. So I'm, like you said, I'm an ELCA pastor, born and raised, third generation African-American Lutheran, where when I tell people that they're often surprised, not too many of us. But I currently serve as the lead pastor for Crossroads Lutheran Church in Santan Valley. So we're right there on the Pinal-Maricopa border, church plant. We're just at 6 years old as a church plant. So I like to say we're beginning to learn how to crawl, right?
Yeah.
So we're just starting to walk. So,
and of course, the pandemic has probably slowed your crawling a little bit as well, huh?
Actually, it's been pretty interesting because when we started Crossroads, I knew that we needed to start a church with an eye towards the future, which meant that traditional ways of worshiping, we wanted to develop a Lutheran church that would be open to new groups of Lutheran people that probably weren't even exposed to the Lutheran church. So for us, buildings were not a priority. We really wanted to develop people to be followers of Jesus with a Lutheran lens. So we never really focused on buildings. We focused on our relationships and growing as followers. So not having a building, being kicked out of the school during this time, has actually forced us to really live into that model and not really have a dependency on the church building. So we've actually been thriving. Our online community, everybody's staying connected. It's pretty cool.
That's great. Tell us about your family.
Sure. So I'm married to Jennifer. We are a blended family. So she has 2 and I have 3. So my kids are all grown and out of the house. So her 2 younger ones are here. So they're 16. So we got a new driver. So be careful. She's ripping and running all up and down the roads. And our son, he's 15. And so Jennifer is a school teacher here in Santan Valley, and she sees it all. So
yeah. Is she, this is a little off topic, but is she in the classroom now or is she doing online?
So she's doing online. She goes to the school. She's in her classroom, but everything is virtual right now.
Yeah. Remind me of how we first met and connected.
Let's see. How did we first meet? I think you came to Atlanta where I was serving my first church there in Atlanta for a conference.
Yeah.
And I knew that you were out at Phoenix and my parents had moved out here. So I'd always just always connected with you all because you had just started Community of Grace. You had just left Community Church of Joy and started Grace.
Can you, just for our folks, give our people a sense, because you knew me back when I was Tim Wright, and I was huge back then. Can you just give a sense of really how big I was in the church at that time?
You were and you are the man.
Yeah. So, Thank you. I just
so So you're the godfather. So when you said you wanted to talk to me, it was very much an honor and a privilege. So for your people who don't know that, yeah.
I'm always glad to meet people who knew me when I was Tim Wright and famous. And, I would travel the world to speak to these huge groups of 10 to 15 people. So, I was so, hey, so we're going to talk about some important things as well. And you and I had a chance to connect a little while ago because our synod did something great. And they had a Zoom forum on the topic of racism. There were about 50 of us online. And the forum was basically to allow people to ask whatever questions they had in a free, safe zone, to stumble over words, to ask the wrong questions, just to begin the conversation together. Which the good news is that we did that. The bad news is that we probably should have done this 500 years ago.
Right.
We're doing it. right? And we're going to come back to this a little bit later, that the Lutheran Church is probably one of the widest denominations in our country. But I want to ask you a question. You told me that I just thought was a great question. You're a third generation Lutheran church. How did you guys become Lutheran? Because we don't draw a lot of African Americans to our.
Yes. So it was pretty interesting. I'll never forget, when I was in seminary, I went to my grandmother and I asked her pretty directly, like, how did we end up in the Lutheran church? I mean, it's so white. And to be honest, I didn't realize that the Lutheran church was majority white until I went to my first youth gathering, but that's another story. I just asked her, I said, how did we end up with the Lutheran church? She grew up in Louisiana, coming from the South, moved to California. So that's where I'm originally from. And it just perplexed me, of all of the churches, of all the faith communities, how was it that we ended up at the Lutheran church? And she shared with me that our family, that they were one of the first African Americans to move into a predominantly white neighborhood. And that the Lutheran church, the pastor there was very intentional, reached out to them and welcomed them, invited them to come to church. And she went to the church, and she said it was so different than her Baptist church growing up. She said it was so nice and quiet, and they only took offering once. And she just loved it. And she just said this is a church for her. But in all seriousness, she said that she was welcomed. She was the first first woman, but first African-American woman to serve as a congregational president. And so it's just been, that sense of the church's welcoming and open invitation that drew her. And, my dad going through, confirmation as well. And then for me as a third generation.
If I may ask, how old are you?
Let's see. I kind of forget now, but I believe I'm 48.
48. So you were born after Martin Luther King.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
So how have you experienced, of course, I lived through some of that as a white man. So, I mean, my story is very different than that. How have you experienced racism in your life, both maybe personally, and then we could possibly talk about systemically, which is that where people get really tripped up. What does that mean systemically?
Sure.
But how have you experienced it personally in your life growing up?
For me, I grew up in predominantly African-American neighborhood in Los Angeles that actually is considered one of the highest grossing income of African-American communities in the country. So it was dubbed the Black Beverly Hills. And so it was Baldwin Hills and Ladera Heights. And so those communities, you always had, African-American professionals, movie stars, actors, entertainers, doctors, lawyers. That was the community in which I grew up in. At the same time, this was the early 70s, and I was part of a busing program. Post civil rights, right? There's this sort of great hope that we have achieved, the sort of racial equality, and the parents of that civil rights generation, they wanted their children to grow up in a post-racial society. And so it started off with a busing integration program in which I was bused to Pacific Palisades. I mean, it was rough. It was rough to live in Pacific Palisades. Oh, to go to school there. But what happened the first semester, the white students came to our school. And then the second semester, we went to their school. And then after that, that year, then families were given a choice as to what they would want to be considered their home school that would then serve as the feeder school system for them, either in the predominantly Black or predominantly white community. And to be honest, the choice, as my parents tell it, it was pretty easy and telling that this is at the elementary level. So I was third grade, that our computer lab at the predominantly African American community, we had maybe 3 computers in the classroom, but the white school, same school district, but just across town, they had 30 computers with a dedicated teacher and learning the basics of computer programming and the whole nine. So immediately my parents began to see the inequality of even how we're educating children. And so for me, my experiences with race started at a very young age. My parents really tried to instill that you don't judge people based on their skin tone, that you don't make those judgments, but it was all around me. I was oftentimes one of a handful of African American students in a classroom. And so there was always this notion that you have to compete, you have to be better. Oftentimes there was a feeling of being singled out, that even though this was now my home school, I oftentimes felt like a visitor, that this wasn't really home. And so I found myself living in sort of 2 worlds. And so I loved, when I reflect later on, W.E.B. Du Bois and his comment in talking about the dual consciousness of African Americans. And so I really lived into that. There was this double consciousness of recognizing my African American community, the culture, the heritage, the roots there. But then there was also another consciousness of whiteness. And so what does it mean to be African American in the school system and living out in this predominantly white culture? One particular story that really sort of ingrained it for me at an elementary level, I was elected. Now, why this happened, I have no idea. God only knows. But from the 3rd grade until the 6th grade, I was elected as the student body president. And I mean, it's elementary school, not that big of a deal. But in my 6th grade year, I later learned that there was just enough complaints that I was president too long, and that the other parents, remind you, this is a predominantly white school, that there was starting to be this complaint that every year I was being elected as the class president. And so I had typical minor infraction at school. I was, running or did something that I wasn't supposed to. But all of a sudden, this got transformed into a major event in which I had to resign my position, and someone else was elected that second semester. And so it was just kind of like, what happened? Like, I couldn't believe it. And so really it was talking and processing it with my parents, and they just wanted me to understand. And that's where that notion of, there's a double standard in our country.
Mm-hmm. Now, some people might listen to that and they'll say, well, you had been president for all those years, so maybe it was time for change. On the other hand, we live in a country where we're trying to teach that elections matter and democracy matters.
Sure.
and not voter suppression. And, probably, we can't say for sure, but probably if you had been a white person, that would not have been an issue
right
when you were in 6th grade.
Right.
So in a sense, what you experienced just in those stories is a little bit of racism against you personally, but also this thing with the school. That's kind of an example of systemic racism, where there are policies in place that disadvantage African Americans or African American communities and that advantage white communities.
Yes.
And you've probably seen that in other places as well. What was your experience like in college then?
My experience in college was very interesting. There was sort of this quest for self-identity, right? I'd predominantly gone to white schools. And even though I went to San Diego State for most of my college career, there was still this notion of trying to seek out my own. And I'll never forget, in my freshman year, my roommates, we would, like all students, that are just trying to find their way. we would just go to, go to cafeteria, go to dinner together. And this went on for about a couple of weeks. And then shortly thereafter, I began to identify, learn, and connect with some of the African Americans on campus and decided to just hang out with them. And so I'll never forget, it was a pivotal moment. And I told him, I said, hey, Steve, I'm going to go to dinner with the guys. And, he knew who they were, what I was referring to.
And Steve is a white guy.
Steve is a white guy. And so I said, I'm going to go hang out with the black guys and go have dinner. And so he said, okay. And very innocently and assumingly, he just, grabbed his bag and walked out with me. And I turned to him, I said, what are you doing? And he said, we're going to dinner. I'm going to dinner with you. I said, I'm going with the black guys. You really want to go? He said, what, I can't? And I said, no, of course you can. I just didn't think you'd want to go. He was like, come on, you're my friend. So we did this, went to dinner, and we did that for another couple of weeks. And there was nothing special. It was just, we went to dinner. We were ready to go to dinner at different times. So he ended up going back with our original group, which was predominantly a white group of students. And he said when he went with them and sat down, that they shared with him, or they told him, oh, so you're not hanging out with the niggers anymore. Mm. And he said that was his wake-up call. That's when he realized what I had intuitively had been telling him and sharing with him. I didn't have the language, I didn't have actual examples, but there was this intuitive feeling that there was a difference and that I just didn't want to continue to subject myself in that environment. And, from that, I really thought that would sort of be a parting of the ways between he and I, but he remained being a friend. And so whether it was going to a dance, a party, he would go to the black parties with me, I would go to the white parties with him. And through that, I just learned that, we just struck up a friendship, and we talked about the complexities of race. But at the end of the day, I also learned too that you have to take each person on their own merit, on their own character. And that's the only way to really overcome our own prejudice, bias, and racism.
That is so good. We talked a little bit a moment ago about how white the Lutheran Church is.
It's pretty white, Tim.
It's pretty white. It's like 89% white. And we have what? 2 African-American pastors in our synod?
That is true. And I must let everyone know that we are not married. So
yeah. So to each other.
Right, to each other. We are not married to each other. Every time we show up at an event, someone just assumes that we're a clergy couple. And so I just want to put that out there on the record.
You're good colleagues. Now, from your experience, and then I'm going to dig deep into your own congregation, but what are some of the things that you see as an African-American Lutheran pastor that may be unintended barriers that we have created in a Lutheran church that make it difficult for us to fully engage with our African-American brothers and sisters?
That's a loaded question.
In 3 sentences.
Right?
Yeah.
I think part of it is our own, I think the way we even acknowledge our own Lutheranism, our own Lutheran identity, that for many people, their sense of being Lutheran really is not about theology. It's more about a cultural heritage. And so out of that, it's, whether it's German, Norwegian, Swedish, there's sort of this claim of Lutheran belonging based on an ethnic heritage. And so as a result, we automatically don't even look to see or recognize the other. And I think when many of the Lutheran churches, as they were established here in North America, they were established as a way not to reach out and embrace the sort of new world, but it was rather, how do these ethnic communities, how do they sustain and support each other? And so for many Lutherans, it was about maintaining within. And so there was never really an impetus for reaching out, for striving to really connect with anyone other than their own. And that is even evident in how we, for a long period of time, for even how we develop new churches. So the typical model for planting a Lutheran church is you just have enough babies and you have enough migration for a new city. And so there's a new group of Lutherans there. So we have to have a church for those groups of Lutherans that have moved into that particular neighborhood. And so there's really not a mandate of living out the Great Commission, of sharing the gospel of Jesus. It's really rooted in this sort of cultural identity. And so I think, one, that because of that, it's created a huge barrier to building relationships with people who are different from us. And I think from that, then it's because we also seek to maintain this sort of Lutheran identity, whatever that may be. We look at other traditions or influences from other communities or cultures as not Lutheran. My mom grew up Methodist, but converted to Lutheran when she married my dad. And one of the stories that she always tells is that as we moved into this church, that someone told her she didn't know Lutheran law as she was working with the youth group. And I was like, Lutheran law? I said, Mom, did they not realize Lutherans are not bound by law? Like, it's the whole message of grace. And we're talking about the youth. So there's this notion of always trying to preserve that as an institution. And I think that's been a big barrier for the Lutheran Church.
Mm-hmm. I grew up Lutheran, and like you did, but in an all-white.
You're going to heaven.
Yes, and it was an all-white church because my community was almost. We were 30 to 40% Jewish in where I grew up. But I do know that when I would go to other Lutheran churches from time to time, their Lutheran identity, even though they were Lutherans, was different. And you would hear it sometimes in Sven-and-Ole jokes.
Sure.
And that was not on my radar. I had no idea, and they were funny jokes, but they were Norwegian jokes and Swedish jokes. And so you can imagine an African-American coming in and hearing Sven-and-Ole jokes.
Right.
Or we would define ourselves, Lutherans do this. They always drink coffee. They have green Jello. And it was always these things that were indigenous, say, to a Minnesota environment or something. And we didn't really have this sense of what does it look like to experience the full richness of all the different voices, the different languages, the different cultures in our worship service. And I think we're wrestling with that. But here's part of my question for you. When we were doing this thing the other night with all of our Lutheran friends talking about racism, Jackie, who is not your wife, but she's the other African-American pastor, she made this great comment. She said, we need to realize here in Arizona, we have about a 4% Black population. And she said, and when you figure that most of the Blacks in this area probably go to Pilgrim's Rest or First Institutional Baptist Church, and it was sort of tongue-in-cheek, she said, you may not reach a lot of Black people in your community. You may not have a lot there. So with that in mind, my question to you is, you haven't prepared for this, so I'm going to just lob it to you. What does it look like to you to be a mainly white Lutheran congregation, but that still is an anti-racist church?
Sure. I think, you did throw that one at me, but I love it. I think what it means is just because a particular ethnic community isn't represented favorably, I think it is still about the mission and ministry that a church seeks to develop, and that it's not one out of charity or one in which we look down upon having a superior attitude or belief system, but that we really seek to create those collaborative partnerships in ministry with other people. And it may be that, a congregation will have to partner with a predominantly African-American or Latino church and create some sort of shared ministry or relationships to develop that. I think it's about, just like my friend who intentionally took it upon himself to say, I'm not going to be or feed into racist thinking or ideology. He made himself vulnerable, and he put himself in positions where he would be in the minority, where it would make him, where it forced him, I think, to have compassion and to begin to see things, see people who are very different than he was, but to see them differently, but also as a human being as well. And so I think those are some of the beginning steps that any congregation can and should do to work towards being an anti-racist church. And I don't know that that's even possible, to be quite honest, to say that we're anti-racist. I mean, there's racist people, prejudice in every aspect. And unfortunately, even in the church, I tell my congregation, I've said it tongue in cheek, but I'm also very serious. I said, I know some of you are racist. Some of you can't believe that you're sitting up here listening to a black man preach to you. And it's like they've just never had that experience. Now, it doesn't mean that they're bad. It doesn't mean they can't overcome those belief systems, but that it's ingrained into, so deeply ingrained that we're not even oftentimes conscious of it. Yeah. So I think part of it is just bringing it to a level of consciousness and then not allowing ourselves to give into those thoughts, those feelings, just because someone is different.
I had a conversation with a mutual friend, Peter Perry, and we were talking about immigration. And, once you start talking about things like immigration or even racism, you start to move into a political world in a way. And because some of these things need political solutions. And I think racism certainly is one of those where there are policies in place, that's part of systemic racism, that do disadvantage certain people and advantage other people. And so one of the things we discussed, and I think that would be true for us, our conversation as well, is as a church to be aware of policies. And policies aren't necessarily neutral, but policies don't have to divide us, Democrat or Republican. If a policy is racist, a policy is racist. And as Christian people, Republican or Democrat, that's a policy where we ought to be writing our congressmen and women saying, let's not do that. Let's find a better way to do it.
Right.
How have you experienced some of that in your own life in terms of encouraging people to be proactive with some of these policies that we have in place? And do you get pushback then? Hey, Pastor, get out of politics and keep preaching the Bible.
Sure. I think because here in Arizona, I know what a slippery slope that can be in the congregation, that we've taken a path rather than getting caught up in, divisive politics, or you say one thing and half the congregation will think the other. Yeah. That we've really been trying to take each and every situation as a person by person approach. And so as we think about policies or actions, we ask, how would that affect you or your family? If that were you, if you were, and I know the whole immigration debate, that was huge, education. And it was interesting. We have a lot of educators in our community. And we had one who was just flat out, just staunch, like, nope, immigration, illegal immigrants, it's wrong. It's, and he was literally holding the law. right? Like, it is wrong. It is illegal. We cannot give in to that as a society. And I told him, I said, I totally agree with you, right? Like, I can agree with you. At the same time, what do you do with this child?
Yes.
It is a child. It is made in the image of God. And where's our compassion? And so, yes, we need to figure out the laws. We need to work those solutions. It's complex. At the same time, we don't want human beings to suffer, especially our children. You know, I'm like, are you not going to educate? Well, no, of course I'm going to educate. It's my job. Okay, so we can still love, right?
Yeah, thanks. That is so helpful. Thank you for that. Last question. What is it about the Lutheran Church that gives you hope that we can maybe do a better job of crossing these ethnic boundaries and racial boundaries?
You know, I'll be honest. I think there are some days when I'm more encouraged and optimistic than other days. But I think ultimately, my hope is that all of us, that we're striving for a better day. We're all seeking to do the best that we can as we allow, you know, that light of Christ to live within us. That none of us are perfect, but that we take that spirit, right? That Martin Luther spirit, the spirit of Reformation, the spirit of change, and we continue to press on. I think that's where I get excited, where I find hope, is just remembering those Protestant roots. Those were protest movements, right? I mean, duh, like that's who we are. It's in our bones. And so how do we continue to advocate and protest, you know, for our generation? That's what gives me hope. It gives me hope that that the church that we will bestow to my children and grandchildren, that it will be, I pray to God that it's more diverse and it's more a reflection of the picture that God has for his kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah. So good. So good. Well, Charles, thank you so much for spending some time with us and telling us a little bit about your story, and God's best to you as you continue to work with your church, especially in these pandemic times. And thank you for reminding my congregation just how fortunate they are to have such a huge star as a pastor.
Yes,
you know,
yes.
They're getting me now after I used to be Tim Wright, and so sometimes they just need to remember.
Now you're just old pastor.
Yeah, I'm just the old. That's right, the old pastor. When's this guy going to retire? You used to have hair, all that stuff. So, Charles, you are such a gift to us. I appreciate it, and thank you so much for your time.
Okay, blessings to you.